Good day, everyone. I'm your host for today's webinar, Mike Lasecki, and it is March 12th, 2020. Today, the topic of our webinar is Walking the NSF Budgeting Walk. At any time during the webinar, you can ask questions using the chat window on the upper right of your screen. We'll have plenty of pauses for questions. In the middle of the screen, at any time during the event, you can download the budget handout, which is a good companion document to this webinar. And the webinar will be recorded. You automatically get a link to the recording and the slides as well, so you can review at your leisure. Thank you for joining today. Just a fantastic topic as we prepare for our proposals in October. I'd like to acknowledge the support of ATE Central. ATE Central provides the hosting services for these webinars. You can find out more about all of the services that they offer and other webinars at atecentral.net. Thank you, ATE Central. It's my pleasure now to turn over to our main presenter, Elaine Kraft. Elaine is the principal investigator of the Mentor Connect project. Welcome, Elaine. Will you tell us a little bit more about yourself and please introduce your co-presenters?
Okay, thank you so much, Mike. We're delighted to have you with us today, and we are very grateful for technology with all of the closures due to the coronavirus and all the fears across the nation and worldwide. It's wonderful that we can still connect using technology and keep everyone safe at the same time. As Mike mentioned, I am Elaine Kraft. I'm the principal investigator for Mentor Connect. Mentor Connect is a special NSF ATE project based at the South Carolina Advanced Technological Education Center, located at Florence Darlington Technical College in Florence, South Carolina. My Mentor Connect co-presenter for today's webinar is co-principal investigator Ellen Haas from the American Association of Community Colleges. She's based in Washington, D.C. Mentor Connect project manager and co-PI Emery DeWitt, also from Florence Darlington Tech, is not with us today, but she is an important go-to person for Mentor Connect help. Today's agenda includes instructions for completing a budget for your ATE proposal and advice on how to prepare a good budget justification. We will give you line-by-line instructions for completing these important components of your NSF ATE proposal. You will be given several opportunities throughout the webinar to ask questions, as Mike mentioned. The slides from today's webinar will be available to you within a couple of days following the broadcast. We will conclude today's broadcast by asking you to complete a very brief evaluation survey. The information you provide helps us improve our Mentor Connect technical assistance webinars and provides essential data needed for reporting to the National Science Foundation. You might wonder why we provide this type of technical assistance to potential NSF ATE grantees. Mentor Connect project objectives are briefly stated on this slide. A primary goal for the Mentor Connect project is to help more of the nation's two-year technical and community colleges benefit from NSF ATE funding. ATE grants are implemented primarily at two-year technical and community colleges, and ATE projects focus on the preparation of technicians in advanced technologies that drive the U.S. economy. Today, we want you to learn how to complete the NSF budget form, how to prepare a budget justification, why a good budget helps make a good proposal, how you can avoid common errors, and where you can find budgeting answers and other help along the way to becoming an ATE grantee. The budget form is an online form within the proposal submission function in FastLane. The information you enter into this form becomes part of your overall NSF grant proposal. If I may deviate for a minute, there is something else you should keep in mind. While it is permissible to submit grant proposals using grants.gov, we strongly encourage you to use FastLane for submitting grant proposals to the NSF. FastLane is set up to support submission of ATE and other grant proposals that go into the National Science Foundation. If grants.gov is used, there are extra steps necessary for all required information to be transferred from grants.gov to NSF. There is a time lag associated with this transmission, so you can't be certain when a proposal will be received in its entirety by NSF. Grants.gov does not enforce NSF proposal deadlines and will accept proposals on the final day after the NSF deadline. In addition, certain forms that are required by NSF are not supported by grants.gov. These forms must be submitted separately to NSF using FastLane. Proposals received by NSF without the required forms are returned without review. These are just a few of the reasons we encourage you to use FastLane for submitting grant proposals to the NSF. The help desk for FastLane works really well. Mentor Connect can help too by providing information and resources to help you navigate FastLane. You may see information and announcements regarding the transition that is taking place at NSF to replace FastLane with research.gov. These are both NSF websites. Note that this is research.gov, not grants.gov. Research.gov is a new website being developed by NSF. FastLane functions are being systematically transferred to research.gov, but at this time, proposals submitted to the ATE program next October can still be submitted by way of FastLane. The new system, when fully implemented, will just take FastLane to the next level to improve ease of use and functionality. One other important point that needs to be made is that with NSF ATE proposals, cost sharing is expressly prohibited. You will want to be very careful throughout your proposal that you do not include anything that associates monetary value with any type of support being provided for your project internally or externally. Now, with those notes, we'll get back to the budget. The budget section of FastLane automatically generates year-by-year budget forms for your use. Within the form, totals are calculated by budget, category, and by year. Once budget forms are completed for each year of the project, an automated system generates a cumulative budget for the proposal. The budget justification, however, is not a form. You will need to develop this document from scratch to explain and provide details about the amounts entered into the budget form and how they relate to your project plan. The budget justification is uploaded as a separate document to support your proposal. The key thing to remember is that your budget should clearly and specifically align with the scope of work of your project. There should be a very clear link between the money being requested and what you're requesting money to support. The budget and work plan should support one another. In other words, they should be codependent. The budget will enable the project to be implemented as planned. The project outlines the work for which funding is needed for implementation. The two work in concert. I will refer to the essential codependency between the project plan and the requested budget throughout this webinar. Many parts of an NSF proposal are codependent. Correlation and consistency throughout is very important. Now, as we're getting started, I'm going to let Mike quiz you just a little bit because we'd like to find out how much experience you have had with NSF budget. Mike?
Well, we're about 50-50 on this one, Elaine. About half of us had had some experience and the others not.
Well, that's great because I think those in each group can learn some things today. Whether you are a budget veteran or this is all brand new to you, we do hope this webinar will broaden your understanding of budget and budget justification preparation. Thank you, Mike. The handout for today's webinar includes information about FastLane access and includes a tutorial for initiating a proposal and accessing the budget section. At this time, I will fast forward to the budget preparation point in the process. Once a proposal has been initiated, you will have access to all proposal sections, including the budget. Each section is activated by clicking on a Go button. The first step is to select funds for year one. You will notice that this is also the screen where you will upload your budget justification. You'll notice the red arrow on the left pointing to this. There are options provided when working on this page that are helpful. For example, if your budget will be very similar year to year, you have an option to have the information from one year transferred to the budget form for the next year. If you do this, however, be very careful to make sure all edits that are applicable to the next year's work are made, and keep things aligned with your budget justification. Realistic budgets are rarely identical from year to year, but rather they change somewhat as the project progresses and activities and anticipated costs change. The budget form begins with personnel costs. First is senior personnel, Section A of the budget. This slide provides a hypothetical example. So who are senior personnel? For completing the budget form, these are individuals who are employed by your institution who serve as principal investigator, co-principal investigator, or in another significant leadership role for the project, and who will receive compensation from the grant. It is possible to have individuals who serve in these roles who are not compensated. It is also possible to have individuals serving in these roles who are from another institution or organization. Compensation for anyone working on the project who is not employed by the grantee institution, however, should be included in a different section of the budget. In sections A through C of the budget, you should only include people who are employed by your institution who will receive compensation. Those who will not receive financial support from the grant for their project work should be included in other sections of the proposal, but not in the budget or budget justification. Another point I've been asked to stress is that an institutional grant writer should not be among those listed as senior personnel in the budget, even if the individual will contribute to the work of the grant. During the Forms webinar on May 7th, we will explain how to include other supporting individuals, such as a grants administrator or a student recruiter, in a proposal. Now, back to completing the form. You don't actually enter names on the budget form, but rather you select from a list of those who have previously been registered for your institution. You may only select individuals who've been previously registered in FastLane. You can add or delete individuals selected for each year of the budget. This is just one of many good reasons for not doing budget work at the last minute. If you discover that a person you need to name in the budget isn't registered, it takes time to register them in FastLane. Also, only someone with FastLane administrative permission at your institution can register a new person. The same thing is true for subawards. For an organization to receive a subaward from your grant, the organization must be registered in FastLane. In addition, all senior personnel included in the subawardee's budget, which is separate from your main project budget, must be registered in FastLane by that organization. These are definitely not last-minute tasks. My advice is that if you have multiple people you are considering including in your budget, register all of them. When you prepare the budget, you just select the ones you want to include. You can also deselect a name if your plans change. So don't delay registering personnel in FastLane because you're not exactly sure who will be included in your budget. One last thing to note on this slide, a Calculate option appears at the end of each budget section. It is helpful to calculate as you go along so that you can keep an eye on budget section totals. Beware, however, that the Calculate function does not save your information should you exit the system. I will show you where you have the option to save your work. This slide shows the very important save command. There is only one Save command key on the budget form, and it's all the way at the bottom of the page. After each section of information is entered, scroll all the way to the bottom to Section L and Save. If you do this, you can come back to the budget at any time, and previously entered information will be waiting for you. Forget? Yep, you've got it. You get to start all over again. So this is an important key to remember and an important step to take. Now, I will walk you through more budget specifics. On this slide, you can see an actual budget form. On the left, the NSF budget categories are listed. This alphabetical and numerical guideline or outline is important. We strongly recommend that you use this outline in the alphabetical order presented as an organizing tool when preparing your budget justification. Both reviewers and program officers will appreciate a budget justification that is organized this way. A little later, I will show you an example of how to do this. NSF budget categories are likely to differ from budgets you work with at your college, and it is important to understand how NSF defines each category so that you can plan and submit your budget accordingly. Once funded, you will need to work with your business office to develop a clear crosswalk between the NSF budget categories and the budget accounting codes that will be used by your college. Now, let's look at each of the budget categories. As you can see, there are two personnel sections. Section A is senior personnel, and Section B is other personnel. A separate Section C is provided for including fringe benefits that are associated with personnel costs at your institution. Once again, let's look at a sample budget allocation for Category A, senior personnel. Note the horizontal red arrow near the bottom of the slide. This is where you can add or delete individuals in this section. In general, individuals in senior personnel roles should be receiving some financial support to conduct the work of the project and help ensure its success. However, if you have a person serving in a senior personnel role who will not receive money from the grant, the individual should not be included on the budget page. Do not include anyone for whom the budget entry will be $0. It is important that the amount you budget for an individual aligns with institutional salaries or pay rates for that individual and with institutional policies and procedures for compensation. An individual may not be paid more or less than their normal compensation from the institution for comparable time and work. Ideally, no individual will be budgeted to receive more than 100% of his or her full-time salary in a given time period, such as a semester. It is important that those working on the grant have a reasonable amount of compensated time dedicated to this work. However, overload pay for faculty in community colleges is prevalent, and NSF supports institutional practice in this regard. No faculty member or other employee should experience a pay reduction while working on a grant. This means that a faculty member who routinely teaches an overload may substitute overload teaching work with grant work to maintain his or her customary compensation. Or a faculty member may be paid extra for taking on grant work in addition to full-time teaching load, as long as the college policy and procedures for this additional or overload pay are followed. If an individual will be receiving overload pay for teaching or completing grant work, this overload pay must be explained in the budget justification. In addition, information about the college's compensation policies and procedures for overload pay must also be referenced in the budget justification. The rule is that an institution's policies and procedures covering overload compensation should apply to other types of overload or extra pay for college employees, such as a teaching overload. The policy and procedures should not be specific only to a person working on a grant funded by the National Science Foundation. Specific language from NSF about overload pay may be found in MentorConnect online resources. Information in the budget and in the proposal need to match. The time allocation for anyone in a senior personnel role for the project will be reported multiple times in the grant proposal. It is important that the information you provide be consistent with each reporting. For example, senior personnel will be named in the project description, and the time each person will devote to the project will appear at least 3 places in your proposal: on current and pending support forms, in the budget, and in the budget justification. It is easy to get tripped up as you finalize your budget, so be careful and consistent by checking and rechecking other places throughout the proposal where this information appears. When you allocate funds to support personnel, you need to be reasonable and very specific, both within the proposal and in your budget justification, about the work the individual will be doing for that compensation. It is never good if an individual appears to reviewers to be overcompensated for too little work, as outlined in the project description. Likewise, reviewers worry when there is too little compensation for an extensive scope of work. Principal investigators are expected to be compensated for their project work time, either with direct financial support or release time. Because time and compensation calculations are an area where reviewers and program officers often find errors, I want to provide a couple of very specific examples to help you do this right. Before I talk you through this example, I would like to note a couple of things. First, if you carefully read NSF guidelines in the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, referred to as the PAPPG, you will see a reference to a 2-month limit on faculty time. However, for ATE projects, faculty are not necessarily limited to 2 summer months, as is the case with many other NSF programs. However, you should discuss any personnel support that is outside the NSF Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide with a program officer before submitting your proposal, and all requested budget support for personnel should be well justified. Also, as a general rule, faculty time should always be reported as academic and/or summer months, not calendar months. Even if the faculty member has a 12-month contract, if teaching contracts are 12-month contracts at your institution and reporting faculty time in calendar months is appropriate for your situation, explain this in your budget justification. Now, in this first example, we will assume that the principal investigator is a faculty member whose 9-month or academic year contract is $54,000. This faculty member plans to spend the equivalent of 1 day per 5-day week working on the project during the fall and spring semesters. In addition, he or she will work full-time on the grant for an equivalent of 2 months in the summer. During the academic year, this work plan calls for 1/5 or 20% of the person's time. In this example, we will assume 1 course release time for a faculty member who typically teaches 5 courses per semester. The typical faculty teaching load may differ at your institution, of course, but whatever your situation, you will want to calculate the percentages and work month equivalents based on your college's faculty loading practices. You then prorate the budget request accordingly. Even if a faculty member will be working on the grant all year long, don't report time as 12 months in the budget. The time that you should include on these forms is the fraction of that person's total work time that will be supported by NSF funds. To do this calculation, you need the person's salary per month and the number of academic months that equate to the planned amount of release time or salary support. For summertime, you just need to know what monthly salary rate to apply. The time calculation for this example gives us 1.8 academic months for the faculty member's time in the fall and spring semesters. To this amount, add 2 months' salary for summer work. The total time should be reported separately by academic months and summer months, but the budget dollar request will be the sum of the two. The picture insert on this slide shows how to report academic and summer months. The calendar box is left blank. You should never put a number in the calendar month box when reporting academic or summer months, and vice versa. Here's a different example. This time we are looking at an individual who is not a faculty member and works on a 12-month contract at the college. The person's 12-month salary is $40,000 in this example. If a gross monthly amount for the person is not available, divide the annual salary by 12 to determine the monthly amount to use. The person's time commitment to the project will be 1 day per 5-day week, year-round, or 20% of his or her time. The first step is to determine the equivalent number of calendar months. In this case, 20% yields 2.4 months. The monthly salary amount is multiplied by 2.4 to provide the budget request per year. Time for an employee who is not faculty should be reported as calendar months. The picture insert on this slide shows how to report this person's time. Fight that urge to put a number in every box. You should never mix calendar months with the other categories when reporting a person's time. If you put a number in the calendar box, leave the other two blank. Also, the budget should be based on prorated time equivalents. Even though a person may be working on the project over an entire 12-month year, you only report the portion of that 12-month time for which grant support is being requested. Note that only 1 decimal place is provided for reporting calendar months, so rounding will almost always be necessary. Now we will check to see if you're still awake. We have a quiz for you, Mike. You want to launch the next poll?
So here we go, Elaine. You're requesting a 20% of a faculty member's salary for 1 course reduction for 2 semesters. How will you enter that on the budget? It's going to take them a moment to figure this out, Elaine.
Okay.
Of course, everyone's been right on top of it and they get it all. Let's give them a couple of minutes to get out their calculators. And at our first question break, which is coming up soon, Elaine, we have several questions, but we'll get to those in a minute. Let's give them 1 more minute. It looks like most of our folks are leaning towards that 0.2 academic months. Let's give them 15 more seconds to get your answers in, folks. We're tracking your responses. Lots of answers coming in, Elaine. All right, it looks like number 1 is the winner here. What do you think, Elaine?
Well, unfortunately, that is not the correct answer. That could be correct if we were talking about a 12-month calendar year, but this is for a 9-month academic contract. So we're talking about 20% of 9 months. So 1.8 academic months is the right answer. So that would have been the third option down. So it is tricky. That's one reason why we spend some time on this. And I will point out at this time that if you are working on this as you put your proposal together and you're just not sure you're getting it right, don't hesitate to call Mentor Connect and ask. We'll be happy to help you figure it out and get it right. What happens if you get it wrong? If you get it wrong, it will not keep you from getting your grant funded.
Right.
This is not considered a fatal error, but what it is a nuisance. And it takes extra time on the part of program officers to help you get it straightened out. It delays your funding award. It can delay your funding award. So it's just a lot better if you get it right when you put it in. So if you need help, just give us a call and we'll help you work through it. It is a little bit tricky to have to report in person months and to have them divided up into all these different categories.
Thank you, Elaine.
Thanks,
I'm going to go back to the presentation.
Or did I go too far? No, I guess not. Here we go. All right, so now we're going to talk about category B, other personnel. You can see from this photo, the actual budget form, the other personnel section includes several categories that are not likely to be applicable to NSF ATE grants, such as postdoctoral scholars. You'll need to remember that these NSF templates and forms in FastLane serve the entire agency, and which does mostly university research grants. So sometimes it's not the perfect fit for those of us working on ATE, but as long as you understand that and you know what you can omit and what you need to do, that's all that matters. You may, however, have other personnel other professionals rather, who will be compensated to help with your project. For example, this is where you should include adjunct faculty who will be paid to provide full-time faculty with release time. This category is also used for such jobs as lab assistant, project coordinator, software or web page developer, or other technical support personnel at your college. In the other personnel section, it is not necessary to name the person who will do the work. In the senior personnel section, it is essential to name the person, but in this section it is not. But if you do know who will do the work, include the name in your budget justification. It always provides a level of certainty and increases the confidence of the reviewers that you really do have a plan that's worked out and you know who's going to do the work. Whether you name the individual or not, the scope of work for any position that is included should be described in the budget justification along with details about compensation. Secretarial or clerical support can be included only in very limited specific circumstances. In most cases, indirect costs are designed to cover this expense. To be eligible, the work must clearly support the work of the grant and be distinct and distinguishable from functions that are normally performed by the college. You can check out the specifics in the NSF Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, Chapter 2, Subpart C, Subsection G, that addresses budget and budget justification. Note that students are typically paid hourly rates. Paid time for students is capped at 20 hours per week during the academic year and 40 hours per week in the summer. Just as a reminder, the total amount to be paid per year that you indicate on the budget form for anyone in other personnel category should be backed up in the budget justification by a description of the work to be done and the hourly or other compensation calculations along with total amounts per year. Once you have entered all personnel salaries and wages, next you will need to determine fringe benefits for the requested salaries and wages. On this slide, you can see that you insert only one number for total fringe benefits on the salaries and wages you included in sections A and B. An explanation of your fringe benefit request should be included in your budget justification, clearly stating the fringe benefit rate that was used. Fringe benefit expense should be prorated based on the percent of a person's time being supported by the grant. If the grant is supporting 10% of a person's salary, then it should also be supporting 10% of total fringe benefits for that individual. This slide points out that all personnel except graduate students should be included in your fringe benefit calculation. Okay, Mike, I think I'm ready to stop and take a breather and answer some questions.
Thanks, Elaine. Here's a couple. Let's start with this one. What happens if a faculty is on a 10-month contract? You mentioned 9 months is typical, but there can be a 10-month. What happens?
Oh, that's perfectly fine. You just adjust your calculations for the 10 months. So what portion of that 10-month contract are they going to be paid for from grant funds?
Okay, good. That's easy. What about adjuncts? How do you include them, or any special rules for adjuncts?
They are very important to many ATE projects, and so they definitely can be included in your budget. You pay them just the way you normally would. You can include them as employees of the college. You can. It depends on the role they're in. Sometimes adjuncts are actually your co-principal investigator, in which case they would go up in the senior personnel category. Other times they might be in the other personnel category. For instance, if you're hiring that adjunct to replace somebody who's going to be working on the grant. So it really kind of depends on what the role of that adjunct faculty member is, but you will want to compensate them in proportion to the time they're going to spend on the grant and at the rate the college would normally pay them for the work they do.
Good. You just answered another question. Can an adjunct be co-PI? And you just answered that one, yes. This may come up later. Where are we going to put evaluators?
Evaluators may be placed in two different places in the grant. The most common place is under consultants. And we'll get to that line item in a few minutes. The other way evaluators can be included is through a subaward. That mechanism is sometimes used particularly for larger projects and for companies that are providing evaluation where they may have multiple people from that company working on the project or maybe doing some special things. So, but those are the two ways that you include an evaluator, either in the consultant line item or either as a subaward.
Okay, good. I think we'll make this the last question for a break. You can see it in the chat window there. It says, Elaine, you mentioned the AT is okay with faculty overload. That was clear. But could you potentially jeopardize other NSF grants by doing that?
I'm not sure what you mean by jeopardize, but yeah. there is a concern that an individual is so overloaded they cannot possibly do the work of multiple grants.
Sure.
But it's not uncommon at all for a faculty member to be working on 2 or 3 projects. They might have, you know, a fourth of their time on one of them, a third of their time on one, and maybe 10% of their time on another, small amounts, so that, and they still may teach a course, you know, just as long as the total work time does not exceed what they would be doing if they weren't doing grant work, which could include just a regular full-time teaching load or maybe a full-time teaching load with some overload if that's been their practice and that's customary for this particular individual. So the current and pending support forms that we'll be talking about in the forms webinar in May, we will be talking about that, and that's the form that helps NSF understand the commitments an individual has and helps them determine whether or not this person has got the time to do the work that's been outlined.
Right. Good. Elaine, thank you very much. Let's hold further questions until the next question break. Folks, keep those questions coming in. Elaine, let's go forward into the webinar.
Okay, I'm going to turn it now over to my colleague, Ellen Haas.
Thank you, Elaine. So moving on in the budget, we'll turn to equipment. So NSF allows you to budget for equipment and instrumentation costs such as laboratory or field instrumentation and scientific or industrial machinery, provided that the items are necessary to support your grant activities and they're not otherwise available and accessible. So you want to keep in mind that you're going to need to justify any equipment you are purchasing for the grant in terms of student use and learning outcomes, and any equipment purchased with grant funds must have a service life of over 1 year. So in budgeting for equipment, if you look at the form, you'll see that this category is where you would list single items of equipment with an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. So in addition to the price of equipment, you'll want to factor in the cost of any modifications or attachments or accessories that are needed to make the equipment usable for its intended purposes in order to come up with that total acquisition cost. So as an example, if you're purchasing a piece of machinery that costs $4,000, but you also need 2 attachments that cost $500 each to make it usable, that would bring your total acquisition cost for this piece of equipment to $5,000. So it would be budgeted in this category. As another example, if you were purchasing laboratory equipment or some other instrumentation that individually costs less than $5,000, then that would be budgeted under materials and supplies, which we'll cover shortly. So the most important consideration for those applying for grants that are small, new to ATE, is that your equipment cost should be relative to and fit within the overall scope of your budget. So including a budget that requests, a significant amount of funding for equipment or takes up most of all of your budget would not be a good idea. So in addition to budgeting reasonably for equipment costs and justifying those costs as to why they are needed for your project, you must acquire that equipment in accordance with your college's organizational practice and policies. And do note that your college may classify equipment differently than NSF. Your college may consider all instrumentation, regardless of cost, to be classified as equipment. But you'll need to go by NSF's definition of equipment when budgeting for your grant. So when constructing costs for your budget, NSF expects that you'll also ask for or look for any available educational discounts from equipment suppliers. Some may offer discounts, and you can apply the actual cost of the equipment to your budget as well as document the discount as part of your budget justification. And as a quick note on what equipment is not, so NSF funds cannot be used to support costs that would normally be made available to you if you didn't have a grant, such as laboratory upgrades or routine teaching activities. It can't be used for teaching aids such as film projectors or whiteboards, nor can it be used for general utility items such as office equipment or office furniture. And most importantly, all equipment costs again will need to be detailed in your budget justification, which includes addressing why you need the equipment, who will be using it, and how it will be used. So we'll move from equipment to travel. And this travel line E in your budget, is only to be used to budget for travel costs for project staff or college personnel that may not be project staff but are traveling to help accomplish project objectives, so such as faculty members that need to attend a professional development meeting in order to test project generated materials in their classes. So you would not budget for travel of advisory committee members or speakers or consultants under this category, only project staff and college personnel that are traveling for the project. So you may include only travel necessary to accomplish your project objectives. So for example, funds can be requested for field work, for attendance at meetings and conferences, and other travel associated with the proposed scope of work. And your attendance at meetings or conferences must be necessary to accomplish your proposed objectives or to disseminate the results of your project. So when budgeting, most institutions have their own guidelines on travel, on mileage rates, and per diem, and NSF accepts these. The budgeted travel allowance should be consistent with the policies of your organization as administrators of the grant. However, do note some restrictions on travel. You must book the most economical form of travel, such as economy class, so first class airfare is unallowable. And if your project requires international travel, which is not likely in the small new to ATE grant category, you would need to budget for travel on U.S. carriers. Travel expenses must be reasonable in terms of the number of trips and the amount budgeted for each one. So again, you don't want half of your budget in travel. You also need to detail your travel expenses in terms of why this travel is necessary and include accurate travel estimates in the budget justification. So if you're budgeting to attend a conference, you need to include the actual hotel rates for how many dates of attendance, search airfares for the time frame that you're traveling and include them, and be sure to budget for meals and ground transportation costs. So you'll want to estimate as best as possible. And an important consideration is that it's unallowable to use federal funds for alcohol or for entertainment costs. And then a quick take on the ATE conference. So in the program solicitation, you're required to budget travel expenses to attend the annual National ATE Principal Investigators Conference. And we hold this each October in Washington, D.C. We also, if you get an NSF ATE award, we hold an entirely separate webinar focused just on this conference. But for right now, we want to get you familiar with how to budget for it. So you're going to want to include funds to budget for 2 team members to attend the PI conference. So if you're applying for an ATE grant in October 2020 and it's funded, you would be expected to attend the 2021 conference. Now, AACC does provide some assistance for the ATE conference. We cover the cost of registration and 2 nights lodging for 2 people per ATE project or center. So you'll want to consider budgeting airfare and other travel costs to and from Washington, D.C. for 2 team members to attend. For your reference, I have the dates of the 2021 conference on the slide. It's October 20 to 22, and the hotel rate for that year is $268 per night. So again, you'll want to think about if your team is coming in for the Getting Started workshop, which is a pre-conference workshop. There's a registration fee involved in that you'll want to budget for, and if that means you need to come in a night earlier, like come in the Tuesday night so you are able to attend the Wednesday pre-con, you'll want to include that in your grant budget as well, as ACC only covers 2 nights for 2 people. AACC actually allows you to bring a team up to 5 to attend for projects, 2 of which we offer some support for. 3 would require a registration fee of $400 per person, and the college would be responsible for the costs. If you would like to budget for an additional person or 2 to attend the conference out of grant funds over and above the 2 that AACC assists you with, you will need to justify that. So NSF is really looking at travel. So if you want to make a case, this is our first year, we really need 3 people on the ground at ATE, you're going to want to include that in your narrative, in your budget justification as to why, versus just writing in a team of 5. NSF also encourages you, if you can, if you want to bring that full team, and say you make a strong case to bring 3, you want to bring 2 more, that institutional funds are allowable to use to support additional people to come to the ATE conference. So on this slide is also meals that the conference offers. So you'll want to think about making sure you budget for any meals not offered by the event and meals incurred during travel for your team of 2, and then for any additional people that you would like to consider bringing. So now I'd like to move to participant support. So if your college is planning to host or offer a conference, meeting, a training workshop, or other short-term instructional or information sharing activity as part of your grant, the cost to support the participants or trainees at those events would be budgeted under this category. So participant support costs can be used for stipends, for travel, and other related costs to support attendance at workshops or conferences. And it's important to distinguish between participants and project staff. Participants are not employees of the college. They are individuals who are recipients of a service or training provided by your college's NSF-funded event or training activity. And while participants perform no direct work for your project, they are a vital part of your grant activities, and you can require them to complete training activities and provide input to be eligible to receive stipends or travel support. So participant support costs, as you can see on the form, are budgeted in the following 4 categories. We have stipends, travel, subsistence, and other. So when budgeting, you'll want to consider that all participant support costs, like all costs in your budget, must be reasonable. In terms of participant support, it must be limited to the days of attendance at the event, plus the actual travel time required to reach the event location by the most direct route available. Participant support costs should also conform with the policy of your college or your grantee organization and follow your college's travel policies. And you'll need to provide detailed information in the budget justification pertaining to participant support costs. So under stipends, you'll need to provide the stipend amount that each participant will receive and what expenses are figured into the provision of that stipend. Under travel, you need to explain the purpose of the travel and the time allotted. And again, note that this travel line is separate from Section E travel that I mentioned previously. That's used for project personnel, and then Section F here under participant support is for your participants or trainees. Under subsistence, you'll need to provide the amount allotted for subsistence, which can be a food per diem or for meals. Again, specify the period for which you are providing for subsistence. And you'll also need to consider that if meals or lodging are furnished without charge or at a nominal cost to the participant, such as having some of those costs be included in a registration fee, then the per diem or the subsistence allowance needs to be correspondingly reduced. So as an example, if breakfast and lunch are included as part of your training activity, you cannot also reimburse the participant for costs of those meals. And again, as mentioned previously, NSF funds cannot be used for alcohol or entertainment purposes. And for under other, you'd want to list any other expenses associated for the participants and how it is relevant and necessary to the project, such as printing and preparing of meeting materials. Some important budget considerations under participant support. You'll need to specify the number of participants to be engaged in or served by the project. And this is a special category in terms of budgeting, as money cannot be transferred in and out of participant support without NSF approval. And it also cannot be transferred in and out of the budget category. So you can't move money around within stipends, travel, subsistence, and other without obtaining program director approval. So you want to be mindful about this category of budgeting. Some helpful hints in review. Again, this category is used primarily for people not at your institution. It must add value to the project. So as an example, if you're planning on hosting a workshop every summer for 30 participants to share a new teaching strategy, you need to think what impact will that have on faculty. The faculty will hopefully learn something, implement what they've learned, and then in that implementation benefit their students and student learning. So you'll want to think about measuring the impact of your participant support activities and include only those that will add value to the project. You can include funds for stipends for high school teachers or students to participate in your project activities, and you can also include stipends for college faculty to participate, though budgeting for their travel may oftentimes be of more importance. Make sure that they have the travel funds to attend. Again, you can budget for food under subsistence if it is associated with a program and your content. And you must, again, include the estimated number of participants. It looks really odd if you include $30,000 in your budget for participant support, but you do not list the number of participants that you expect to serve. And then I mentioned that you cannot transfer money in and out of this category without obtaining program director approval. Just so you know, to obtain approval for moving money around within participant support, would be to go into FastLane under notifications and requests and state why you need to move the money between the subcategories or the money you originally had budgeted in participant support to another line item. And as long as the request is reasonable and you include a rationale, your project director will typically approve the change. But you just do want to be aware of participant support and the guidelines around those line items in particular when budgeting. And now, Mike, I do believe we have a question break.
Yes, I'll fire some fast questions at you, Ellen. Here's one. My institution does not allow travel for part-time employees. Can we include that travel cost in the stipend line?
If you can include
a workaround.
Yeah. So if your part-time employees are traveling on behalf of the project, yes, you can, and it's necessary to achieve your project outcomes or to disseminate its results, you can include travel funding to support them to go to the events or training that are required.
Okay, good.
I will point out, Mike, that would not be in participant support. If
yes, it's in travel.
College. Yeah, it would have to be in another category.
Okay, good. Thank you. Here's another one, Ellen. You mentioned how important it is to put down good, strong cost estimates, including room rates and things like that. You mentioned the $268 at the Omni for the October conference. Does that include taxes and fees?
Well, it's $268 for the room we're covering because AACC is tax exempt, but that's a good question. If you are budgeting for an additional night or you are budgeting to bring in someone that the conference is not covering outside of your two, then it would be $268 plus tax, and it's typically 14.5% in DC presently.
So thank you. Good point there. Let's shift to equipment for a minute. I'm a faculty member. I want to put a coordinate measuring machine in my grant. It's important to my curriculum. It costs about $50K. Can I just put in $50,000 even and say I'll be sure to get the best price? Can I do that?
Well, I think they're going to want to, you can write that you're getting the best price, but I think you would want to put in rationale for why you're using it, how it's being used, how you will benefit, and then you're going to need to put in industry estimates based on research that you've done and potential discounts that you can find. So you want to get as close to possible at the actual price and the actual discount that you could get for that piece of equipment.
I think I've seen sometimes a tendency to round up a number saying, oh, it'll be something like this, but I think what you're saying is you need to be more specific as you can be at this point.
Yes, it helps you to be as specific as possible on your budget items, yes.
Is there an equipment limit cap? You can see that question that's just come in for these small new to ATEs.
There is not an equipment limit cap for small new to ATE, again, but they are looking to make sure anything you're doing is reasonable within the scope of your budget. So you have a $300,000 award. So you need to consider what is reasonable within the time frame that you're looking to do and what your equipment costs are. So while it's not capped in small new to ATE, they're really looking at the cost of equipment versus the rest of your activities. And if it's really tipping the balance, it's something very high in terms of expenditures versus the rest of what you're trying to do, that's really not going to work well.
Good answer.
I might also mention that there is another funding opportunity that is pretty equipment specific. that can make a nice second grant for someone who gets a small new TATE. So if upgrading equipment to align with your industry standard now is really driving your project. What you may want to do with the small new to ATE is upgrade enough for one class or for a palette of what you want to do, and then look to the next grant, which could be an equipment specific. It's called an instrumentation grant. And that would allow you to get additional pieces of equipment or to build out this new capability that you're interested in. So there are multiple ways to go about it, but as Ellen said, you don't want to overload this first small new to AT with equipment. That'll raise questions.
Sure, that makes sense. Last question for you, Ellen, for this section. You mentioned you can include for the equipment modification, accessories, things like that. What about a service agreement? Would you put that in, bundle that in with the equipment costs?
It's my understanding that the service agreements are not allowable under equipment costs. Elaine, do you have further thoughts on that?
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
So that's not an allowable cost.
You can't modify your facilities to accept the equipment. If you've got to, provide a big concrete platform to put a piece of equipment on, that's the college's responsibility. You can't use grant money for that.
Thanks for that clarification. Ellen, take us forward.
Okay, thank you. All right, now we move to other direct costs. So other direct costs that can be included in your proposal budget include materials and supplies, publication costs, consultant services, computer services, subcontracts, and other. So as with all expenses, you'll need to identify and itemize all anticipated direct costs in your budget justification. So materials and supplies. So this includes items that are project specific and demonstrated as necessary to run the project that cost $5,000 or less. So if you remember, equipment is classified as having a total acquisition cost of $5,000 or more, and this category excludes equipment. So if you're purchasing 30 handheld GPS units for surveying at a cost of $200 per unit for a total cost of $6,000, this amount would be budgeted under materials and supplies as the individual cost per unit is under $5,000. And again, note that NSF doesn't allow for the purchase of desks or office furniture or for general office supplies that are not being used exclusively for the project. Materials and supplies need to be directly tied to the project, and items such as plasticware, chemicals, and project-specific office supplies can be budgeted here. For publications, documentation, and dissemination, so funds may be requested related to documenting, preparing, publishing, and sharing research findings and supporting the material coming out of your grant activities. And this generally includes your reports, editing, documentation, storage of data and databases, web pages, and production of posters or exhibits. For example, as a new ATE-PI, you're expected to attend the annual ATE-PI conference and participate in a showcase session to share the strategies and resources of your project. So funds in this category could be used to develop handouts or to disseminate information on your project outcomes. Under consultant services, this is where you would budget for people that are working on the project, but they're not part of the project staff. So this applies to those individuals that are paid a fee for service as external contractors. Again, you'll need to identify and justify your need for consultants in the budget, as well as include anticipated costs and length of service. That details how many days or hours the consultant will work and at what rate of pay. So for example, when budgeting for the use of a consultant, $6,000 might be for 10 days at $500 a day plus $1,000 for travel expenses, or 60 hours at $80 per hour plus $1,200 for travel expenses. You'll need to include this level of detail and again justify your need for the consultant. And you can't budget to pay a consultant more than their reasonable and regular rate of pay. Another thing to consider is your college's or state's purchasing and procurement rules and whether you will be required to bid out a consultant contract after receiving grant funds. Note that NSF and reviewers prefer that you name your consultants and identify the skills, experiences, and value they bring to the project. But if you're not able to name a consultant due to your purchasing rules, you'll need to include a detailed job description that states the caliber of the person you would seek to do this scope of work. And as an example, as Elaine mentioned, an external evaluator is often budgeted as a consultant to the project. For computer services, the cost of computer services may be requested only if your existing institutional policy is to bill computer services as direct costs. And this category typically refers to costs for computer-based retrieval of scientific or technical data and information necessary to support or inform your work. And justification of established computer service rates at your organization must be included. General purpose computer equipment, such as for word processing, should not be requested, so that's not allowable here. Under subawards, new grantees are not likely to have subawards, but as some of you on the webinar may be applying for larger projects, that could include a subaward. I'm just going to briefly cover this category. So subawards are used to fund a discrete portion of work that's carried out by another organization. So the subcontracting PI is responsible for the work proposed in the subaward, and the subawardee is responsible for the management and oversight of the subaward budget. So, but as the prime institution, which is your college, you're ultimately responsible for all project work, including the subaward. Subawards require separate budgets. So on the main budget form, you would list the total annual subaward costs, but your budget justification must include details on the subaward, including a description of work to be performed and a clear description of the basis of selection for the subawardee. And the subawards are named on the budget, have a separate budget and separate budget justification as well. So in addition, in order to list a subawardee, that organization needs to be registered in FastLane. So you'll want to make sure that that is completed as well. Under other direct costs, any other direct costs not previously identified and necessary to support the project must be included here and detailed and itemized in the budget justification. Some examples of potential items budgeted here include conference registration fees, costs associated with preparing exhibits or travel for advisors. And then we move to the picture of total direct costs. This is the sample form from FastLane that will calculate your total direct costs. This is the easy part. If you've entered all of your numbers correctly, the total direct costs for your grant proposal are calculated for you. You've completed total direct costs, but your budget is not yet complete, as you'll need to work on indirect. And I will turn it over to Elaine to cover indirect costs with you.
Thanks, Ellen. Every institution receiving a grant award from the NSF must include indirect costs in the budget. This is money from the grant that helps support the business office and other operations at the college. Including indirect cost for the grantee institution is mandatory. Your college must include in the budget and recover indirect cost at the federally approved rate that applies to your institution at the time the grant award is made. The rate in effect at the time the grant award is made will apply throughout the life of the grant, even if the college's rate changes in the interim. The same is true for any subawards included in your project budget. Including indirect costs for subawardees is also mandatory. Each subaward will have its own budget form and must include a separate budget justification, as Ellen just mentioned. Each subaward will also have its own indirect cost rate, and that is likely to differ from the grantee institution rate. The first thing you need to determine is if your institution already has a federally negotiated indirect rate established. These rates change over time, so make certain that the one used in your proposal is current. Before a grant award can be made to your institution, you will be required to provide verification of your federally negotiated indirect cost rate. So, what if your institution does not have a rate established? This is an interesting situation. Your institution will not be eligible to apply for a federally negotiated indirect cost rate until a grant proposal you submitted has been funded. At that time, your college may apply to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to negotiate the rate. MentorConnect has resources to assist your college with this process. If you find that your institution does not already have a rate, or the rate's expired, or whatever, what should you do in the meantime? NSF states that institutions without a federally negotiated indirect cost rate should use the NSF de minimis rate until a rate for the college is established. The de minimis rate is defined by NSF as 10% of modified total direct costs. Modified total direct costs are determined by subtracting ineligible costs from total direct costs. In calculating indirect cost, ineligible costs, or costs that may not be included in the calculation, are participant support, equipment, and for the most part, subawards. NSF does allow the first $25,000 of a subaward to be included in indirect cost calculations. One point I want to make is that it is important to pay close attention to the impact that indirect costs have on your project budget. Some institutions or community college systems have relatively high indirect cost rates, and this has a big impact on the amount of money you have to apply to the actual work of the grant, because indirect costs are included within the total grant request amount. Indirect costs are not in addition to the amount you are requesting for the project. So if it's a $300,000 grant request, those indirect costs are part of that $300,000, and it's important to know what part of that total that they make up. Don't get tangled up about this. If you are applying for a small grant for institutions new to ATE and you submit a budget for more than $300,000, the proposal most likely will not be reviewed as a small grant for institutions new to ATE. Instead, the proposal will be placed for review with the larger, much more competitive general pool of ATE project proposals. Make this error, and your chances of being funding go way down. It is likely that you will find yourself reworking a budget multiple times to accommodate indirect costs. The sooner you understand what the impact of indirect costs are on your overall budget, the better you can plan your scope of work. Here are 3 things to keep in mind as you are grappling with the issue of indirect costs that must be applied to your grant budget. First, institutions may have more than one federally negotiated indirect cost rate. For example, it is not uncommon to have an on-campus rate and an off-campus rate. The off-campus rate is typically lower. What is important to understand about this is that NSF leaves it up to the college to choose which of their federally negotiated indirect cost rates it will use on any proposal. For this reason, you may have access to a lower indirect cost rate, so you should ask. Second point, another little known fact is that NSF never asks how the college uses the indirect cost it collects on a grant. The portion of the grant award that the college receives as indirect cost may be used as the institution wishes. College presidents have the latitude to allocate some or all indirect costs collected from a grant back to the project or the department that is implementing the project. Or they can do something else with it. You may want to explore this possibility at your location. Last, not budgeting or taking the appropriate amount of indirect costs for your project is considered cost sharing, which is strictly prohibited in the NSF ATE program. Now, let's look at how you calculate indirect cost for your budget. The rate is the federally determined percent to be applied, and the base is the total of specific costs in the budget to which the rate applies. The rate is predetermined, so for calculating the indirect cost amount for your project, you will need to determine the correct base amount for the indirect cost calculation. Indirect costs are typically based on an institution's personnel cost, which may include salaries and wages or the combination of salaries, wages, and fringe benefits. In some cases, the indirect cost may be based on overall cost of institutional operations. If based on personnel, which is most common, then the base will be the total for the budget sections A and B, or perhaps A, B, and C. On the other hand, if your indirect cost rate is based on all operational costs, then the calculation is a little more complicated because you must determine what is referred to as the total modified direct cost, or TMDC. The total modified direct costs are determined by subtracting from the total direct cost the budget items that are not allowed as part of the base. In either case, you must describe your base amount for each year on the budget form and enter the base amount. Then you enter the rate to be applied without the percent sign. The budget form then automatically calculates indirect cost using the rate and base numbers you've provided. It can be tricky to get all of this to work out right and not exceed $300,000, which is yet another good reason not to put off budget work until the last minute. Let's recap. Indirect cost rates are federally negotiated, but these rates are not determined by NSF. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is the federal agency that will make this determination for your institution. You must include indirect cost in your proposed budget. Either your institution already has an indirect cost rate or the NSF de minimis rate must be used until a federally negotiated indirect cost rate is established for your institution. There is no requirement that an institution have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate. So the NSF de minimis rate can be used indefinitely if your college chooses to do so. The categories of costs to be used for determining the base for your indirect rate calculation are determined when the rate is negotiated. The basis for your college's rate is noted in the official negotiated indirect cost rate document. If you use the NSF de minimis rate, the base will be determined by calculating total modified direct cost, or TMDC. Some NSF budget categories or line items are not eligible for indirect costs. Expense items not to be included in the base for indirect cost calculations include participant support, equipment, and all but the first $25,000 of subawards. Total direct cost must be reduced by subtracting the ineligible expenses to determine the total modified direct cost. On the budget form, enter the rate without converting the percent to a decimal. The system will convert the number you enter to a decimal as the calculation is done automatically. Use the calculate function once you have entered the base and rate to see that the indirect cost has been calculated correctly. Now we're getting to the bottom line. When you select the Calculate button in Section J, the system will automatically determine the total direct and indirect costs being requested. Note that budget category K, small business fees, is not applicable to NSF ATE grants, so you get to skip this section. For NSF ATE proposal budgets, the amount in this section will match Section J. Your request will be the same as the sum of direct and indirect costs. After completing all of this work, like magic, you have a neatly formatted budget in the FastLane system. You repeat the process for each budget year of the project. Once budgets for all years have been created, then the cumulative budget will be generated by FastLane. The cumulative budget, as the sample here shows, reflects totals for budget categories for all years. The total budget request must not exceed the maximum allowed for the grant for which you are applying. Now, Mike, I think we'll stop and take a breather and get a couple of questions before we wrap up with the budget justification section.
Thank you, Elaine. Here's one. Recruitment and outreach activities are important in many of our projects. Where does that go in the budget?
It depends on what type of expense it is. If it's travel and it's college personnel doing the travel goes under the top travel category. If it is an event for participants, you're bringing, say, high school students to the college to do something, then those the support for those students who come, say you're going to provide a program and refreshments, will go in the participant support category. So it really kind of depends on what the activity is. And again, if you have questions in doing this when you're working on your budget, just give MentorConnect a call and we'll see if we can help you parse it out and put it in the right place.
All right, here's one more question for this section. Everyone has been sitting on the edge of their seats wanting to ask this question. For our new grant, Elaine, Well, I'll use me as an example. I need a new MacBook Pro with one of those quad processors. I really need one. So I'd like to put that in the grant. Where would it go? You think that would fly? Is it equipment? It's $1,450. What's the view of that?
Well, first of all, it's not equipment. That would be considered materials and supplies. It doesn't matter. A lot of colleges inventory smaller dollar items that are classified as highly pilferable,
Yes.
things that are likely to walk away, but because they're college inventories and therefore classifies it as equipment does not make it equipment for NSF. You go by dollar amounts for them. As a general rule, just a tool that a faculty member wants and thinks they need for their work would not be grant eligible. However, if you are going to introduce some new software to your students, some new things that you cannot do with your current equipment, you've got to have a new device in order to support the software that you need to use to teach your students. It is very specific to the curriculum improvements that you're making. You only have a desktop computer at the college, but you're going out and doing a lot of outreach and going into high schools and doing programs for people. You might need a laptop that can travel with you, or an iPad or something that can help you when you're off-site to do grant-specific work. It really has to do with whether this item is very specific to the work of the project, and you justify that when you request the money for it. So it's not a hard and fast, no, it can't be included, or yes, it can. It all depends on how it's going to be used and whether or not it's considered essential to your project.
It makes a lot of sense, Elaine. Very good question. One brief follow-up to that outreach. If you're doing things like buying materials, newspaper, outreach flyers, things like that, that would go under materials, right?
Yes, materials and supplies, that's correct.
Okay. Take us forward, Elaine.
Okay. Before I do that, I do want to just answer one or two other questions I happened to see in the chat box and couldn't multitask enough to type an answer.
Yes, sure.
There was a question about when an evaluator might be included under other personnel. That would be the case if you have a large institution and you have chosen someone internal to the institution to be your evaluator. This is permissible to NSF. They need to be in a completely different area and department of your college. Not, the idea is that this person be very separate from your project and bring no bias to the evaluation process. And so it is possible in some situations to find someone like that on your campus. If that's true, you could budget that person under other personnel because they are a college employee. There was a question about subawards and travel and subawards. Those subawards do have their own budgets, and those budgets have a travel line item. So if your subawardee needs travel money, they budget it in their own budget category. The last one I wanted to address was a question about an ATE center and whether or not they could be new to ATE. The rule on being classified as new to ATE or eligible for small grants for institutions new to ATE is that you have not had an ATE award in 7 years. If the date of your last ATE award was more than 7 years ago, then you are newly eligible as a small new to ATE. Otherwise, you would only be eligible for other funding categories. Okay, so with that, Mike, I'm going to continue on to talk a little bit about how you put together a good budget justification. Let me move the slide forward. Now, first of all, I'm sure you could see from the forms that we've shared or from your experience that the budget form itself allows you to put dollar amounts and some names and some other information, but it really does not allow you any opportunity to provide details about why you are requesting the funds or how you determine the dollar amounts you're requesting. You will prepare a budget justification for this purpose. The budget justification provides an opportunity to demonstrate that the budget is right for your project. It is important that reviewers conclude that you are neither asking for too little nor too much money to implement the work plan you've described in your proposal. The reason you are requesting the funds for various purposes should be logical. You should never ask for money in the budget that doesn't directly tie to an activity, something, someone that you've described in the project description. One of the examples that gets thrown out all the time is someone who budgets for a piece of equipment in the budget, and nowhere in the project description have they mentioned that piece of equipment or how it relates to what it is they're trying to accomplish. That will almost never work. It is of great importance that the budget and the project description be mutually supportive. You are allowed up to 5 pages for your budget justification. That number has gone up recently, and it's very helpful for being detailed. The budget justification is uploaded separately within the budget section. It is not counted towards any other page limits in preparing your proposal. As mentioned earlier, each subaward included in the proposal also requires a budget justification and up to 5 pages of budget with a separate form for each year. There is no specific format required for a budget justification. However, a well-organized budget justification will contribute to a more competitive proposal overall. I will share an example in a commonly used narrative format, one that we recommend. First, some general pointers on budgeting. Think about costs associated with everything you are planning. Carefully align the activities with corresponding budget amounts that will make the work possible and be reasonable. Research all anticipated costs. Don't guess. It takes time to research costs and but it enables you to be very specific about the amounts of money that are needed and for what purpose. A high level of detail is expected. This is yet another reason not to delay building your budget and preparing your budget justification. It just simply is not a last-minute job. Once your budget justification is prepared, convert your budget justification into a PDF document before uploading. Fastlane can do some funny things to special characters. Uploading PDF files eliminates this from happening. Even so, after uploading, always check to see that the document looks right and that you haven't exceeded the page limit. Your budget needs to make sense to reviewers and program officers. So if someone asked you for money, what would you want to know? How much money? If the total is made up of several costs, such as travel, how much is being requested for each component of that total? Include such details as hotel rate per night, number of nights, airline ticket price, baggage charges, meals, and mileage. For whom do you need the money? Personnel, participants, consultants? Who are these people, and what will they contribute to the project? And with what compensation, over what period of time? What items do you plan to purchase and why? How will the material and supplies or equipment be used in a project activity to benefit students or participants? Don't request money for equipment or anything else that hasn't been described in the project description as integral to the project. Attention to detail is important to reviewers. They want to know that you have really thought through what it will cost to implement the project plan. They want to know that resources have been thoughtfully planned and costs carefully calculated to ensure the success of the project. Now, let's look at a sample budget justification. This is a sample narrative budget justification. Paragraphs are created to describe cost. Reviewers find it very helpful if you label your paragraphs with alphabet letters corresponding to the NSF budget form. For example, A will be senior personnel and E will be travel. If you're not requesting money in a category, just list the alphabet letter and indicate not applicable. This print is very small, but I think you can get a sense of the level of detail in this example. The format makes it easy for a reviewer to follow. The organization matches that of the budget form itself, and the specifics clearly convey that the prospective grantee has put considerable thought and attention into this budget. This slide shows the remainder of the budget justification. Please note that for any consultant included in the budget, the rate of pay per hour, total pay, and statement outlining the consultant's scope of work is expected. Now I will share with you some common mistakes program officers have encountered with budget justifications and proposals. One is that the maximum number of pages for the budget justification has been exceeded. Since they've recently increased the number from 3 to 5 pages, I think that probably an error is more likely to be made if your budget justification is too short. So you want to avoid that. Justify every amount you request. Details show that you have done the research and calculations necessary to make your request as precise and realistic as possible. You want to organize your justification to align with the budget form and organize it for clarity. Use the same headers you see in the budget form. Don't list an amount to be paid to a consultant without specifying the rate of pay by hour and total hours or days of work. Be clear about what the consultant will provide to the project for the requested compensation. If your budget includes overload for pay, you must explain who will be paid an overload, how much overload will be paid for what time period to do what work. You must also reference the college's policy and procedure for faculty overload pay that will be followed in making the payment. Don't be vague. Provide a list of specific materials and supplies you anticipate purchasing and the estimated cost per item, and indicate how each item will support the project. Just tossing in $5,000 for materials and supplies without any detail is likely to be questioned. Be detailed in requesting travel funds. Why are you traveling? What will be accomplished or shared with others at the event? What is the breakdown of costs associated with the travel? Adjunct faculty are neither participants nor consultants for your project. Part-time faculty should be budgeted in Section B under Other Personnel. And I will add one more. The travel section of the budget is only for college personnel. Travel for participants should be budgeted in participant support. Travel for consultants can be included in the consultant line item or in other direct costs. Travel for anyone else who isn't an employee or a participant, such as an advisory board member, should be included in the other subcategory of other direct costs. Okay, Mike, I think we're ready to take some questions again.
We do have some, Elaine, but I wanted to make one comment. You mentioned very strongly that developing a very creditable budget justification is important. And I just wanted to emphasize that a reviewer looks at your budget. If he sees all these details that you're talking about, or if she sees all these details, the credibility for your proposal goes up. And I think that's an important point you made. I just wanted to emphasize that again.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I have a question for you from one of our participants. Should you attach quotes to support your budget justification or scopes of work for consultants?
You can't include them as attachments. They're very specific. We'll talk about this during the forms webinar, but they're very, very specific and limited attachments that you can put attach to your proposal. However, what you can do is just verbally state that, you know, company A has quoted us this amount for this piece of equipment. Company B has quoted us this amount. Costs may change slightly between now and the time it's purchased, so we're taking the average of the two, and that's what we're budgeting, or something like that.
Good.
So you can put enough detail to let the reviewer and the program officer know that you have researched it, you've looked at these costs, but you don't need to include the quotes. And in terms of the scope of work for your evaluator or something, you won't be able to, I mean, evaluator contracts are fairly long documents usually, and you're not going to have room for all of that.
Right.
But what you want to do is you want to specify that they will be doing, you know, they may be doing site visits, they may be doing, you know, or certainly should be doing annual reports for you, they should be doing data collection, they may be doing survey development, you know, whatever the kind of the basic activities that your evaluator has planned or that you anticipate that your evaluator will be doing working on your project. Just outline those things, and if there is travel, be very specific about the number of trips and what the cost per trip would be and why you think it's going to be that.
Good. Here's a final question for you. People are wondering, who actually develops this budget? Is it the PI? Is it the grant developer? Is it the grants office? Is the team? Who actually gets involved in developing the budget?
Usually the person that's responsible for submitting this proposal online, you know, keying all this stuff in, which may be your grants office, it may be the PI. It varies from institution to institution. That person would be the driver of the budget, but it really needs to be teamwork. For instance, the faculty members are going to know what equipment, supplies, and things
Sure.
they need. They're the best ones to know the vendors for that and to find some prices that they can feed into this process. The personnel costs, somebody's going to have to talk to your HR department and get some pretty accurate salary numbers and that sort of stuff. This isn't information that's floated broadly around colleges.
Right.
So the person that with the authority to access this information to figure these things out should really be doing that. So it really depends on the cost, and it does need to be teamwork, but you all need to funnel it into one person who's managing the submission of that budget.
Well, thank you, Elaine. I'm going to click the slide forward and ask you to make our final announcements for today.
Okay. Thank you. We hope that you have found this webinar informative as you move forward with developing your ATE proposal and work on your budget and budget justification. You will actually have two options for reviewing the information we've provided today. The entire recorded webinar can be listened to and watched as many times as you like. And as Mike mentioned, it will be automatically sent to everyone who registered for the webinar and should be out in a couple of days. Or to access specific information, we also will have a tutorial available at the MentorConnect website that allows you to go directly to the specific budget line item or other information you seek. The tutorial is based on the webinar, so the same information is available to you either way. The tutorial makes just-in-time help available to you throughout your preparation. Another resource we encourage you to access is a tutorial on evaluation basics for non-evaluators. This tutorial, based on 6 short segments, walks you through the basics of what you need to know and do to comply with NSF ATE requirements and incorporate a strong evaluation plan for your project. The 6 segments only take about an hour to view from beginning to end. You have the option of accessing this resource in a way that works best for you, watching as many segments as you wish at any time or revisiting segments as often as you like. This tutorial has been provided by our partners at Evaluate, another ATE-funded project. My last reminder of the day is about the final webinar for the spring, which will be on the multitude of forms that are required and must be submitted with all ATE proposals. This webinar will be broadcast live on Thursday, May 7th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern. Be sure you have this important webinar on your calendar. This slide just reminds you how to reach MentorConnect. We look forward to helping you throughout your proposal development process. Now, Mike, I'll turn it over to you for the evaluation survey and closing remarks. Thanks, everybody, for being with us.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Such a detailed presentation. It was very important for you and Ellen to give all those information today. I'm going to listen to this webinar again on the recording. There were just so many interesting details there. So colleagues, this officially ends our webinar. I'm going to now launch the survey in a new browser window on your machine. The survey will open. There's just a few questions. Help us improve our webinar series. Thank you for joining today, Elaine. Thank you again. Here goes the survey. There it is. It's opening up in our other windows now. So please take that survey. Colleagues, thank you again for joining today. See you at a future MentorConnect webinar. Goodbye, everyone.